Hi everybody and welcome, and I want to talk about something from the Parsha that's a source of a very, very familiar ritual. One of the most famous rituals of the Pesach Seder is the mitzvah of drinking 4 cups of wine or grape juice, and that is a rabbinic commandment. The Torah does not say you must drink wine at the Seder, but the rabbis based it primarily on the fact that in this Parsha, when God informs Moshe, remember what happened? Moshe was very reluctant to go to Paro. He argues with God. He says, I'm not worthy, you're not worthy, I'm not able to speak. I mean, he's arguing with God over and over and over again. Moshe is an extremely reluctant leader. He finally goes, and things get worse. And he says to God, he says, I told you, God, I didn't want to go, and you send me. And not only are things, God, didn't get better, they got worse. And God says, this is the end of last week's Torah reading, that you will see that I appeared to the Avot, I appeared to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I made many promises to them, and I did not fulfill everything in their lifetime, but they never questioned me. And you are questioning me. Lochein, Emor Livnei Yisrael, tell the children of Israel, Ani Hashem, I am God, and that name of God means I am the one who keeps his commitments. And then there are 4 terms that express different parts of redemption. Hotseisi, I will take them out of Mitzrayim. Hitzalti, I will save them. Goalti, I will redeem them. Lakachti, I will take them unto me as a nation. These are called 4 lishonot of Geula, 4 terms of redemption. And to commemorate the 4 expressions of redemption, our sages enacted that we drink 4 cups of wine to commemorate these 4 lishonot of Geula. There is a 5th term that appears right after the 4. God will bring us to the land, but that number 1 is not part of the extrication from Mitzrayim. That's a separate thing. And number 2, that has not been that will not be fully fulfilled until the advent of the Mashiach. In fact, that is the source of the Ashkenazi custom, that there is in fact a 5th cup at the Seder that we do not drink, and it is said to be Eliyahu's cup, the cup of Elijah the prophet. And the reason why it's Eliyahu's cup is because Eliyahu will announce the coming of Mashiach, and then we're going to drink a fifth cup. There are some Chassidim, by the way, that actually do drink 5 cups at the Seder. It's a relatively rare custom, but they base it on a particular opinion in the Gemara that the Rashbam changed the text. In other words, if you looked at a standard Gemara, you would not find any mention of a 5th cup. But there is a girsa that some Gaonim had that actually mentioned a 5th cup, and there are some Chassidim that follow the 5th cup. Most of us do not do that, but we do have the Kos of Eliyahu. So now I want to share with you 2 different midrashim, and then draw a correlation between them. Medrash number 1 raises the question, why are there 4 languages of redemption if in fact Yetziat Mitzrayim is a single event? We were taken out of Egypt. Why are there 4 terms that describe it? Midrash number 1 says, because Paro issued 4 decrees against the Jewish people, and therefore there's 1 language of Geula keneged every gezerah of Paro. Gezerah 1 was servitude, avdus. Gezerah 2 was his initial demand that the mialdos, the midwives, kill the male babies as they're born. Remember, this was directed to Shifra and Pua, well actually Yocheved and Miriam, and that gezerah was aborted, no pun intended. That gezerah was not carried out. And then the third gezerah, which was partially carried out, is when the soldiers were instructed to take the males and throw them into the water. So gezerah number 1 is avdus. Gezerah number 2, which was not carried out, was the directive to the midwives to kill the Jewish boys.
Sorry, what was the first again?
Slavery itself. Yeah. Second one was the directive to Shifra and Pua. The third was the directive to the soldiers. And the fourth was this final gezerah, that after Moshe Rabbeinu went and demanded that Paro send the Jewish people away, and Paro says with great defiance and great chutzpah, "Who is this God that I should listen to his voice? And why should I send the Jewish people off? I've never heard of this Hashem." And Paro says, "You guys have too much time in your hands. You're agitating for civil and political rights because you're not busy enough." So the fourth gezerah was the gezerah where they have to scatter and look for straw and on their own instead of it being given to them, and they would have to make bricks. Their quota of bricks would not be diminished. So Medrash number 1 simply says, 4 gezeros of Paro, 4 Lishonos of Geula. We simply correlate the Lishonos of Geula to the 4 evil decrees of Paro from which we were extricated. Obviously, we were extricated at different times. The Gezerah of Shifra and Pua was never carried out, and that was way before, that was 80 years before the Exodus, because that is when Moshe Rabbeinu was born. Okay. Now, there is a Medrash number 2 that makes a different point. And it basically says that the 4 Lishonos of Geula are not simply referring to the exile and persecution of Egypt, but they are in the nature of divine promises that God will redeem us from all of the future exiles that the Jewish people will be subject to. And we know, based on rabbinic tradition interpreting the book of Daniel and the book of Zechariah, that there are 4 kingdoms that are said to rule over Israel. We're not counting Paro because that's before we came to the land, but from the time we come to the land till the final redemption, there are 4 Malchuyos, 4 Golios that rule over the Jewish people. The Golus number 1 is the Golus of Babylon, the Golus of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar conquered the land of Israel and eventually destroyed the temple. That's Golus number 1. The Babylonian Empire was overthrown by Persia, and we know that Cyrus, Koresh, allowed the Jewish people to return, but we still remained under Persian rule, at least for a brief period of time. So that's Golus number 2, the Golus of Persia. Persia was eventually overthrown by Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedonia, and that established the Golus of Yavon. Right, so during the Persian exile was the Purim story. During the Yavon exile, that was the Hanukkah story. So we have Bavel, we have Paras, we have Yavon, and then we have, and the brief period of the Hasmonean dynasty is treated as part of Yavon because although the Hasmoneans were Jews, they were actually Hellenists, and therefore it really doesn't count as a redemption. And then we have the 4th Golus. That is the Golus of Edom, the Golus of Rome, that is connected to Esav, because Esav is treated as the ancestor of Rome. And the Golus of Edom, of Rome, is a Golut that we are still in today. It is so much longer than any other Golus. It is the Golus of Edom. Why are we in the Golus of Rome? There is no Roman Empire, obviously. So in what sense can we still say the Jews are in the exile of Rome? So there are a number of reasons why this is a description that is still appropriate. Number 1, even though there's no Roman Empire, but the destruction of the temple that they effected has not been undone. So we are still suffering the effects of their exile, number 1. Number 2, Western civilization is largely a product of Rome, although the Greeks were the ones who originated many of the basic institutions, but Rome were the ones that spread the wisdom of Greece throughout Europe and hence to America, other countries. And therefore, in a sense, the Golus of Edom, the Golus of Esav, is the Western civilization that most of the Jews live under. And the final is that Rome eventually became the seat of Christianity. Peter, we talked about Peter a few weeks ago, that some say Peter was actually a good religious Jew, but whatever his agenda was, whether he was openly a follower of Jesus and secretly a Jew, or whether he was a follower of Jesus inside and outside. That's a separate issue. I refer you to our share that we gave a few weeks ago. But nevertheless, Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and Rome became the seat of the Catholic Church, and that dominated much of the world. And even today, Christianity is the religion that dominates where most Jews of the world live. So for these various reasons, we are still in the Golus of Rome. Now, there are other midrashim. Now, again, the concept of the 4 exiles is something that you see in the book of Daniel in several places, where Daniel has various visions of 4 animals, the statue of Nebuchadnezzar that has 4 different metals in it. So this notion of the Arba Goliot is very, very fundamental. And in fact, the Medrash reads this in to the very beginning of the world, when it says, Haaretz haisa sohu vavohu, and the world was, the universe really, was jumbled and confused, in a confused state. And there was darkness on the face of the depth. And the Spirit of God hovered over the water. Right? This is describing what the world looked like before God started creating all of the different things. So here's what the Medrash says. This is an allusion to world history. And the land was desolate. That is the Babylonian exile. And it was confused and jumbled. That is the Persian exile. And there was darkness. That is the Greek exile. On the face of the depth, that is the Golus of Rome, which is so long and deep, so many thousands of years, as if it's never going to end. And the Spirit of God hovering over the water is the Spirit of Mashiach that will be sent by God. And the water are the waters of Torah, in the merit of the Jewish people learning the Torah and studying the Torah. This is a very powerful medrash, because what the medrash is telling us is that at the very beginning of creation, these 4 exiles were identified as part of the structural growth of how there is Geula. Again, this is a deep thought. We don't fully understand the repercussions. But somehow, just as a seed germinates from its disintegration, there is a disintegration of the seed, and then it sprouts. So too, the world needs a certain process of disintegration and persecution in order that ultimate goodness emerge. There's another analogy as well to birth. It's a different analogy. There is the analogy of the seed, in which something needs to be destroyed in order to come forth with something new. That's also the phoenix bird. And then there is the analogy of birth, in which great birth is preceded by excruciating labor pains. And indeed, we describe the coming of Mashiach, the difficult times before the coming of Mashiach, as Chavlei Mashiach, the birth pains of Mashiach. These are the 4 Golios. Now, I will say, you have to remember a basic historical point, that the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud were compiled before the creation of Islam, before Muhammad. So as a result, the last persecution, so to speak, that our sages explicitly talked about was the persecution by the Romans, and in particular the Christians after Constantine converted the empire. So as a result, Rome, Christianity, they were identified as one and the same. However, in later sources, we find a talk about a 5th exile, or at least something that will be added to the Roman exile, and that is said to be the exile or the persecution of Yishmael. Yishmael, of course, is the ancestor of the Arab. Yishmael was not Muslim, but nevertheless, Yishmael was the ancestor of the Arab nations. And it was seen by later authorities, like Rav Chaim Vital, the Arizal, that the last and worst persecution that we will face before the coming of the Mashiach shall come from the Koach of Yishmael. And Yishmael is the most dangerous of all our enemies, because only Yishmael has the spiritual merit of circumcision. And only Yishmael has the name of God as part of their national identity, just as Yisrael. El, Aleph Lamed, is the name of God. There are only two nations that have the name of God in their name, Yisrael and Yishmael. And Rav Chaim Vital finds an allusion to Yishmael in one of the prophecies of Daniel, because Daniel describes, Daniel interpreted a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of a huge statue. The head was gold, and the torso was silver, and the arms were copper, and the legs were iron, and the feet, the toes, were half iron and half earthenware. So, and then a big stone came and knocked over the statue, etc. So Daniel explains it this way. The gold represents Babylon, and the silver represents Persia, modern day Iran, Persia, and the arms represent Greece, and the iron legs represent Rome. But the combination of earthenware, clay, in fact the expression clay feet in English comes from that part of the book of Daniel. The combination of clay and iron represents that at the very end, in the heels of Mashiach, there will be a connection between Rome, Western civilization, that's iron, and clay, that represents Yishmael, that are mishtachaveh, the way Chazal described Yishmael, they bow down to the dust on their feet, that's the clay. So therefore, that indicates that the Jewish people, the Acharit HaYamim, towards the coming of the Mashiach, will suffer from two sources, Western civilization and Yishmael. So the Holocaust would have been an example, obviously, of sorot that are imposed on us by the West. And then we have Arab or Islamic fundamentalism, which is coming from the East. And just for good measure, the Maharal brings some midrashic sources that say that at the end of time, Yishmael will unite with Paras, with Persia, to persecute Am Yisrael. And of course, Persia is Iran, so that indicates a type of unholy alliance between Persia and Yishmael that will be super, super difficult to surmount. So these are the four Galiyot. So now going back to the Medrash number 2, I don't want to lose my trend here. Now, as Medrash number 2 says, that the four Lashonos of Geula are divine promises that God will extricate us from the 4 future exiles, 3 of which we already have been redeemed from. We will be exiled from Babylonia, from Persia, from Yavan, and ultimately from Rome, which is the final and longest Golus. If you remember Hanukkah, the song that most people sing when they light the Hanukkah candles, Ma'oz Sur. Ma'oz Sur, if you recall, is largely not about Hanukkah. There's only one stanza about Hanukkah. It is about all of the exiles, starting with Egypt, and then Babylonia, then Persia, then Greece, which is the Hanukkah story, and then it ends with a prayer that God should redeem us from the evil empire, which is described as Rome, primarily Christian Europe. Okay. Say again?
I can just add
Yeah.
a footnote. It also calls on God's vengeance on Rome.
On Rome, that's correct. In fact, that last stanza is a very, very heavily censored stanza. So sometimes if you're singing it from different Siddurim, you'll actually have different texts because it was very, very heavily censored. Some of the censored versions do not allow reference to destruction to Rome.
A very brilliant journalist, Brian Bloom, who writes for the Jerusalem Post, and he wrote just before Hanukkah, advocated that last stanza should be changed because a desire for vengeance is not in harmony with with a civilized view of the world.
Yeah.
I wrote a letter to the Post opposing
Any changes?
opposing that opinion, and it was just published on Friday.
Oh, I'd like to see it. You know, obviously, you're going to have the same problem with the Pesach Seder. The Pesach Seder, after benching, when we open up the door, and we welcome Eliyahu Hanavi, we also talk about God, may you pour your wrath on. But again, this is not a general statement that we want non-Jews to be hurt. This is a specific reference to those who want to destroy your people, those who don't believe in you. That's a very different thing. It's very targeted against negative, destructive ideologies. It's like as if you were to say, we pray to God to destroy Nazis. That wouldn't be regarded as anything negative in any way. Okay, so it turns out we have two different midrashim. One midrash correlates the 4 Lashonos of Geula to the 4 Gezeros of Paro, kind of localized to the persecution in Egypt. And we have another midrash that correlates the 4 correlates the 4 Lashonos of Geula to the 4 exiles that have unfolded and will unfold. By the way, in terms of each exile, Maharal explains, each exile has a unique character. The exile of Babylon is the exile of persecution. Because Nebuchadnezzar took away our sovereignty. He destroyed us as an independent nation. He destroyed the temple. And he enslaved us. He was not anti-Semitic. From Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, this was just a matter of another military conquest. But he made us a slave people. Persecution. The Golus of Persia was the Golus of genocide, or at least attempted genocide. Because the most outstanding event in the Golus of Persia is the book of Esther, when Haman literally wanted to eradicate us. So Babylon is persecution and enslavement. Persia is genocide, or attempted genocide. Now Greece, Yavon, which is the Hanukkah story, this is already post-biblical. The biblical account ends with the Persian Empire, right? So anything about Greece is really, other than the prophecies of Daniel, is post-biblical. Alexander is post-biblical. Greece was a very different challenge. Greece was the challenge of cultural assimilation. In a somewhat perverted way, and we talked about this, Antiochus was a very enlightened person, although he was enlightened in the sense of putting a gun to your head. Meaning Antiochus was not anti-Semitic. Antiochus was perfectly willing to give Jews full political and social rights and civic equality as long as they get rid of their distinct, unique rituals and service of God. Don't circumcise. Don't keep Shabbat. Don't keep Rosh Chodesh. Be like everybody else. And if you be like everybody else, we will treat you like everybody else. It turned into a war only because the Maccabees refused to give in. Most of the Jews, in fact, gave in. So the Nisayon, the trial, the challenge of the Golus of Yavon, was not persecution or genocide. It was cultural assimilation. Now, we then come to Rome. Now, the Roman Golus is many times longer than all of the Goluses combined. We are still in the Golus of Rome. But in many ways, the Maharal points out, Rome is kind of like the Japanese, right? The Japanese take ideas that other people have invented and improve them and make them more effective. Rome is a composite of all of the 3 preceding Goliot. And in different times and in different places, you sometimes have what you might call the Babylonian aspect of Rome, and you sometimes have the Persian aspect of Rome, and you sometimes have the Greek aspect of Rome. So, when Jews are persecuted and discriminated against, that is the Babylonian part of Rome, the galut of servitude and persecution. When there is attempted genocide, like the Holocaust, that is the Persian part of Rome, rearing its ugly head. And when Jews face not persecution and enslavement and not genocide, but the pressures of cultural assimilation. That is the Greek part of the Roman exile. And in most of the Western world today, that is exactly what we suffer. The Lubavitcher Rebbe used to say, it was easier to be a Jew in Siberia than suburbia. That in Siberia, you could not escape being a Jew. Even if you wanted to, you would be reminded about it constantly. But it's precisely in the world of opportunity and the world of freedom, for which we are grateful. Of course we are grateful if we have freedom to pursue whatever it is we want to pursue. But there's something very dangerous about freedom. And when you have the freedom to be whatever you want, you have the freedom to be nothing at all. You have the freedom to throw away your Judaism. You have the freedom to discard it. Just as countless people on the boat to Ellis Island as they were entering New York Harbor, at least legend has it, I don't have an actual story how many people did it, but there are stories that they say some immigrants took their tefillin and threw them over the boat into the ocean, as if to say, we no longer need this. And indeed, in many, many cases, if you read the Chronicles, even the immigrants who were religious, because they were raised religious, their children, as they adapted to the new world, often stopped everything. They simply said, we don't need this. This is the land of unlimited freedom and opportunity. So therefore, in many ways, the Maharal says, Rome is a composite. Over the 2,000 years, and it hasn't ended yet, we have persecution, we have genocide, and we have cultural assimilation, which is the most dangerous of all, because it comes in the guise of a friend, it comes in the guise of a welcome, and you have to be more scared sometimes about the Gentile culture that welcomes you than the Gentile culture that repels you. And again, these are difficult themes because on one hand, Chazal do acknowledge that there is wisdom in the world. There is wisdom, there is insight. We should be open to it. No one is suggesting we should reject all of the chachma that exists in the world. But it is quite a difficult endeavor to know what to accept and what to reject. What do you bring into your home and into your soul, and what do you send away? In life, it's always easier to be an all or nothing person. Right? A person might take the position, I reject everything outside of the Torah and the Gemara and the mitzvot. Or you could be a person that's such a big tent person, I admit everything in. But a discriminating person of wisdom understands that things are not all or nothing. Things are not black and white. There are infinite shades of gray. And one has to make difficult decisions. What of the wisdoms of the world do I admit? And what must I reject? There's a beautiful statement in the Talmud Yerushalmi. We know that Motzei Shabbos, when Shabbos is over, we insert in the Amidah a paragraph about Hashem separating between the holy and the profane. Hamavdol ben kodesh l'chol. Now, in which bracha of the Amidah do you put in that paragraph? So it mentions in the fourth bracha, which asks God for knowledge and wisdom. So the Talmud Yerushalmi says, why would the bracha of Havdalah be in the blessing for knowledge and wisdom? Talmud Yerushalmi says, because if there's not wisdom, you're not able to make discriminations. The ability to discriminate is a sign of wisdom. When you lack wisdom, you look at things as it's either all good or all no good. A person with wisdom understands that there are subtleties and discriminations. Yeah, I'll just tell you a very interesting little story. Maybe I shouldn't tell you this, but okay, but I'll tell you this anyway.
Oh, yes, tell us.
I may get in trouble for telling it. One of the shiurim I used to give in Or Sameach, I used to give a shiur in what you might call different movements within halachic Judaism, which had different hashkafos. For example, of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who believed in secular studies along with Torah studies, versus those who did not believe in the importance of secular education. We spoke about Zionism versus anti-Zionism. There's the different divisions that existed. I'm not talking about reform. I'm talking about legitimate differences of opinion that existed within halachic Judaism, Hasidus versus non-Hasidus. So apparently in those early days, I may have said something that was not conventionally within the yeshiva world. So somebody reported on me to the Rosh Yeshiva, to my nominal boss. So they don't do that anymore. And I'm not sure if I became more politically correct or whatever, or people got used to what I teach. I'm not sure which way it went. But it hasn't happened since. But I remember 7 years ago, I was called to the Woodhouse, as the expression goes. Is that the expression? Called to the Woodhouse? Woodshed, I'm sorry, woodshed, yeah, woodshed, that's right. Called to the woodshed, right, I'm sorry, Woodhouse, yeah. The Rosh Yeshiva is not alive anymore, not the present Rosh Yeshiva, but he said something very remarkable, very remarkable. He said to me, you and I both know that life is very, very complicated. And there are valid points of view in all of these different views. But he said, when you present it to our students, many of whom are newcomers, they get confused. So he actually advocated the idea that, you don't have to and you shouldn't develop the complexity of different types of views, because then people don't have a clear direction in life, and therefore he was in favor of what you might call a certain amount of censorship. Now, this is fascinating, and you can think about this. In other words, this is not something to be laughed at or dismissed. And that is, there are legitimate points of view in all sorts of places. But sometimes, in the interest of giving people more definitive guidance in life, there may be a certain merit in not exposing everybody to all ideas at all times. I was kind of floored. I was actually speechless because it just struck me as an absolutely very, very interesting idea. The spiritual mala, the spiritual advantage of censorship. Is it good? Is it bad? You can go either way. I don't want to get into a big discussion, but you can understand that this plays out in daily life, particularly in Israel, all the time. The insularity of the Haredi world. Now you could say
share with us what was the nuance?
I don't even remember. It was nothing very. I think it was nothing very revolutionary. I think I just quoted Rav Kook or something, and I got reported for mentioning Rav Kook. Huh? He was on Weinbach.
Very, very dangerous.
And that's Rav Kook is very dangerous, as you know. So you get in trouble just by mentioning the name. But the insularity of the Haredi world, is a phenomenon. And you could say, oh, it's so insular, they're not open to the wisdom of the world, they don't see the secular studies that could prepare them for jobs and to be productive in the economy, and all of those are true criticisms. The other side is, once you open doors, you're also opening Pandora's boxes. So in all of these decisions, how we raise our children, what type of family environment we want to have, there's always a difficult decision to be made, and arguments can be made on both sides of the equation as to what is better. Is it better to be open, take things in? Is it better to be insular? The short answer is that they're both correct, and they both have drawbacks, they both have positives, and people will strike the balance in a different way. Only a person of great wisdom can make the discriminations that are necessary. Many people cannot make those discriminations, so there may be a legitimate fear of contamination, so to speak. Yeah.
Question, isn't there a flip side to this? Is there a danger by an oversimplistic...
Of course there is. Of course there is. Everything's dangerous. Life is... Yeah.
Apropos, I mentioned a minute ago a very brilliant journalist who recently commented that Ma'atzur should be changed. He studied at Or Sameach. And today, he's secular.
He must have taken my class, okay.
He could have done. Today he's secular. Maybe he's one of those who reacted negatively to the oversimplification.
Listen, I don't want to get into a full discussion of this, although it's a very, very worthy topic. All I can say is there is nothing safe. There is literally no decision that will be safe. Everything has upsides and potentials for really, really good things, and everything has risks. And people strike the risks in different ways, and the problem is, for different people, certain approaches are better than other approaches. And therefore, one needs to be very wise as to what is the appropriate educational strategy, pedagogy, parenting, when do you open, when do you close, right? All of this is the Chachma of Havdalah. But nevertheless, we do have to admit, as a general phenomenon, cultural assimilation is extremely dangerous, and it's a toxic drug, as it were, and if you overdose on it, it can very definitely kill you. I mean, I'm in correspondence with a young man, I mean, quite amazingly, who was raised as an Orthodox Jew. He went to yeshiva. He spent several years in Kollel, full-time learning. And at the age of 31, with 3 children, he and his wife have decided they no longer believe in God or the Torah. And this is absolutely devastatingly catastrophic to their families. And yet, they've kept it a secret from their young children, but they're planning about a meeting. I mean, just imagine, the kids are already in school. Kids are 3rd grade and 4th grade. Been religious all their lives. In religious schools, the parents are planning what you might call an atheistic meeting in which they're going to explain to their children that we no longer, I mean, how does that work? But it happens. This person got very interested in analytical philosophy.
Dangerous.
He pursued it to the very end. He's a very thorough scholar and researcher, and he came to the conclusions, right? So, dangerous stuff. Things happen, right? So as a result, although I have many, many issues with the insularity of the Haredi world, I cannot be totally critical of it, because there may be reasons for why certain decisions are made. Okay, but to go back to the main thought here, I want to go back to my main thought. So it turns out we have 2 different midrashim. Keep them side by side. Midrash number 1 correlates the 4 lashonot of Geula to the 4 decrees of Paro: servitude, genocide by the midwives who did not carry it out, genocide by the soldiers who did carry it out, and then the gathering of the straw. Those are the 4 gezeros of Paro. Second medrash, the 4 lashonos of Geula correspond to Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. So, Rabbi Gedalia Shor, great Rosh Hashiva, if you know Rabbi Shor, actually makes a fascinating correlation. He wants to correlate the 4 decrees of Paro to the 4 exiles. And the underlying concept is the following idea. We were supposed to be in Mitzrayim for 400 years. That's what God told Abraham. But God took us out after 210 years because we had sunk so low to the 49th level of impurity. Had we stayed another minute, the amount of time it takes for dough to rise, we would have hit level 50. We would have been irredeemable. So God cut the process short. God curtailed the process by 190 years. Now, you might think, Baruch Hashem, that's great. We got out of Egypt 190 years early. Unfortunately, there is a devastating consequence. And that is, because we never completed the process, we need thousands of years of rectification of all of the Goliyot in order to rectify our failure to finish the 400. Chemotherapy is actually a very excellent example. A person, God forbid, has cancer. A person undergoes radiation or chemotherapy. Now let's imagine that the toxicity of the chemotherapy is so strong and so powerful that we have to stop the process early because it'll kill the patient. So we stop the process because it will kill the patient. But as a result, the cancer continues to grow. And later, you might need a more radical treatment because he couldn't finish the process at the time. Spiritually, that's exactly the way this is understood. There is a correlation. Because Paro's 4 decrees were not fully carried out over the 400 years, we need thousands of years of galut to weed out the spiritual impurities. Remember, the Egyptian exile itself is described as an iron furnace where the heat of the servitude burns out the impurities. But if we were left with impurities, they continue to fester. So seen in this way, he actually wants to make a one-to-one correlation between the 4 gezerot of Paro and the 4 exiles. Gezerah 1 was servitude. Well, that corresponds to Babylon, as I indicated before. Babylonia was the first nation, once we got to Israel, that enslaved us and took away our sovereignty. Gezerah number 2 is the miyaldot, the midwives were told to murder the children. That corresponds to Persia, because what was Persia? Genocide. The Gezerah of Haman. And indeed, just as Shifra and Puah did not carry out the genocide of Haman was not carried out either, but that was the golus of genocide. Now, Gezerah number 3 is more symbolic, because the Chorah, Gezerah number 3 is also genocide. That's when the soldiers were commanded to throw the babies in the water. Why is that compared to Greece, Yavan? So here, the association is more metaphorical. And that is, we know that Yavan represents a source of great wisdom. We talked about this for Hanukkah. Yavan's ancestor was Yefes. Yefes is the 3rd son of Noach. Shem, Cham, Yefes. When Shem and Yefes covered up their father's nakedness, remember Cham was mocking his father's nakedness, and Shem and Yefes walked backwards to cover him up. So God gave a blessing to Yefes. And Yefes is a pun, because Yefes is like Yafah, beauty, Yofi. Yafta Elokim Yefes. God shall give beauty to Yefes, the ancestor of Yavan, Greece. The Yishkon, and he shall dwell. The Alei Shem, in the tents of Shem. The tents of Noach's oldest son, from which the Jewish people come. Semites comes from Shem. So what does this mean? So Rav Shimshon of Al-Hirsch explains that Yefes was given the blessing of bringing beauty into the world. Beauty exists in many different ways. There is the logical beauty of mathematics and philosophy. There is the aesthetic beauty of sculpture and even the human body in athleticism. There is drama, there is comedy, literature generally. Yefes was given even music. Yefes was given the capacity to bring beauty into the world, aesthetic beauty, intellectual beauty. Shem was given the mission of godliness. Right? Avraham comes from Shem. So Noach's blessing is that the wisdom of Yefes and the beauty of Yefes is good. And it belongs in the tent of Shem, but it is good only if it is joined to godliness, and not when it's separate. So in that sense, just as Torah is compared to water, because it purifies and gives life, even the wisdom of Greece is water as well. But you know, water has a double-edged sword. Water keeps me alive, and water cleans me. But if I immerse my head in it totally, I drown, I can no longer breathe. So metaphorically, if Yavan represents the confrontation of the Jew with the culture of the world which threatens to overwhelm him, that can be expressed as drowning the baby in the water. Because the water is chachma, the water is wisdom, the water is beauty. All of that is good. But when you totally immerse yourself in it to the exclusion of Torah, it becomes suffocating and destructive. And therefore the 3rd Gezerah of Yavan corresponds. The 3rd Gezerah of Paro, throwing the babies in the water, corresponds to the 3rd Golus of Yavan. But now we come to the 4th exile. Now the 4th decree of Paro. The 4th decree of Paro, at first glance, doesn't seem to be so significant. they have to gather their straw. How does that correlate with Rome? So here, once again, we have to think a bit more metaphorically, allegorically. That is, when the Torah describes the need to gather straw, it uses the word scattering, vayofetz ha'am. They have to scatter. Instead of being in one place and the straw is brought to them, they have to gather, they have to scatter and look for it. And that makes things, by the way, a zero-sum game, in the sense that when our straw was delivered to us, so each person can do his best and that wouldn't hurt the other person. But when we're competing to get the straw, whatever I find is not available for you. Meaning to say, this introduces a certain element of competition in the slavery business. Now, if we identify the fourth gezerah of Paro as the gezerah of scattering, which is the word the Torah itself uses, pizor, hafatza pizor, then you can understand why the Roman exile might be described as a golus of scattering. And this is in several discrete ways. First of all, geographically, the dispersion of the Jewish people in the golus of Rome is much greater than any other golus. In the golus of Babylon, we were in Babylonia, basically. In the golus of Persia, we were in Persia or Babylonia. The golus of Yavon, we were in Eretz Israel, actually. But the golus of Rome, there are Jews everywhere in the world. There are spiritual reasons for this, because it says, although we don't actively convert, we do not proselytize. But it's important that every corner of the world, there be the influence of Judaism on society, to make righteous Noachites, whatever it would be, to be involved in making society better. So Jews have to be everywhere. There's a friend of mine who's a rabbi in Israel, a little older than me, Rabbi Yisachar Franz. Some of you might have heard of him. He's a very, very popular lecturer. When he's in Israel, you should try to get him. He comes usually once a year. And so when they advertise his shiurim, it says Rabbi Franz has listeners on every continent, including Antarctica. So there is Torah even in Antarctica and the like. So on that level, Pizor were scattered. But there are other levels of Pizor. Pizor is also sinas chinam. We are told, what do Chazal say? The first temple was destroyed because of idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans for the sin of hatred and polarization. So psychologically, we are separated from each other. In the family, we see this as well. Husbands, wives, parents, children, rising divorce rates, kids at risk, family disintegration. All of this is Pizor. But there's another aspect of Pizor that is the most subtle of all, and that is the inability to focus, the distraction of modern society. Consider the internet, consider social media. Consider the idea that many people cannot sit still for 1 minute without going online and twittering as to what they had for breakfast, what they're eating at this moment. Look at Twitter. Twitter does not have great, deep conversations about things. The word Twitter is a very apt description. It is the twittering. Now, this is not just a harmless little thing. I don't mean to single out Twitter. But it basically means that modern culture has created a huge sense of distraction, preventing us from focusing, preventing us from concentrating, preventing us from thinking about what our life is about. And that is the greatest type of scattering. It is the scatteredness within the human psyche that can no longer focus or direct its energies. I'm told, there are a lot of online classes on YouTube, other internet sources, and a standard college class was always 50 minutes. I'm told, I'm not sure if this is true, that now on the average, the classes are only 25 minutes. And this is because it was discovered that people are not able to concentrate for 50 minutes anymore. And the whole psychology of web surfing is the notion of jumping this to this to this to this to this to this to this. It's a serious problem, not just in the Jewish world. It's a serious problem in educational theory as well. Books have already been written about how web surfing rewires and reprograms the circuits in the brain. So, this is the correlation to gathering straw. We are scatterbrained. We don't focus. We don't know what to do with ourselves if I don't have some connectivity with someone else. And this is a great, great tragedy because a human being never discovers who they really are and what their life is about. And you can get paralyzed by information overload. Everything's on the internet. Valid information, junk information, false information, true information. You want to Dvar Torah, you want to Dvar Torah in the Parsha. All right, I'll look up something online. What are you going to get? 1 million hits or something? How many Parsha things are in the internet? Unbelievable. Information overload. What do you do with so much information that you wind up absorbing nothing simply because you don't know how to make a decision? I remember I once, when I was in D.C., there was a specialty delicatessen. It wasn't kosher, but I just remember seeing an advertisement, which really hit me. He says, "We carry 300 brands of mustard." So I was thinking, let's imagine my wife, it's like an hour before Shabbos, and my wife says, we're out of mustard. Can you go to the store, get some mustard? And I go to this place, and there's 300 types of mustard. What do I do? I would literally be paralyzed with indecision. And that's kind of the predicament of modern man. The old saying, who was it? Was it Yeats, one of the poet, or T.S. Eliot? Life goes out not with a bang, but with a whimper. It's a famous line. I think it's from T.S. Eliot. That is, sometimes the real enemy is not some dramatic catastrophe or some dramatic evil person that wants to kill us. Sometimes it's the very triviality of life that kind of destroys you from within in a very, very slow way. And you don't even notice as that process happens, and you get more and more sucked up and sucked in to that process. So b'kitzur, therefore, this is a very interesting correlation, how the 4 gezeros of Paro match up to the 4 exiles. And it reminds us that the dangers of exile are not always persecution or genocide, or even cultural assimilation, because cultural assimilation is at least using wisdom and knowledge, albeit against the Torah. This is a very, very different phenomenon. This is simply the phenomenon of not being connected to yourself, as if your personality is outside of your body, and there's not even a union of all of your faculties. And that's very, very different. It's interesting that this issue about university education for religious Jews. Now, obviously, in the United States, it's not much of an issue. The standard in the United States is, at least within the more modern Orthodox, that people get university educations. But as you know, in the Haredi world, it's a very, very big debate issue. And even in Dati Leumi, among the Chardal, similarly, there will be reservations about it. Now, if you would ask somebody, a rabbi 100 years ago, why somebody shouldn't go to college, they would say, go to college, they're going to read Kant and Spinoza, and they'll be exposed to all sorts of anti-Torah ideas. Today, although I just gave you an example of someone that actually went down that path, but today, it's almost halavai a college student would read Kant and Spinoza. That's not the issue. Today, the issue is lifestyle. The issue is decadence. The issue is sex. The issue is drugs. There are many, many different issues which are not connected to the intellect or to wisdom or to knowledge. It's connected to a very degenerate environment in many, many ways. And this is the difference between the Greek Gullus and the Roman Gullus. The Greek Gullus was a Gullus of intellectual connection to ideas, some of which may be antagonistic to Judaism, and that was something that was very dangerous. But in this Gulut of scatterbrainedness, the real Nisayon is the decadence and the emptiness of the lifestyle that often exists in the secular world, that a Jew must be very, very careful to try to avoid. Right, so these are just some things to think about, and so when you drink your 4 cups during the Seder, a little while to go, you can think that we're not only talking about the past, but we are also focused on the galut that we are still in. So you'll have a good week.
Rabbi, do you have
It's